A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Joshue Rowe is the ACL State Director for New South Wales and the ACT. Joshua, a special welcome along.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks for having me. It's always wonderful to be on the show. And I was very, very interested to hear about the person who's coming on to talk about a biblical perspective on gaming. I'm personally not a gamer either, but I would be very fascinated by that conversation because I never even thought that we might be able to provide, a devotional perspective to gaming. It's very interesting.
Look, who knows where that conversation's going to go? And, I'm looking forward to it too. I'm not, I'm sort of, as I say, in the deep end here with the gaming, but hey, we're going to find out. And, I'm not sure it'll be one of those hard-hitting conversations about how bad video games are. I think today's going to have a bit of an upbeat, even positive perspective on what you can do with devotions for video games. Hey, Joshua, let's start with a big win. I think this is a big win. The misinformation, disinformation bill, it's been dropped, and Labor's admitted there's no pathway for this controversial bill to be passed in the Senate. What are your observations about what's happened on the weekend?
This is a big win for religious freedom for all Australians, Neil. We obviously, seek to protect religious freedom at the ACL. It's something we lobby very strongly on. We believe that there is, provisions for freedom of expression right across Australia so that people can have open conversations, share debate, explore different ideas to find their way to truth. And that's why it's so important for us as the Christian lobby, is because we believe that Jesus is the truth, that he is the way to salvation, the Father, and we want freedom in conversations for people to be able to explore ideas so that they can ultimately find their way to Christ, but also talk about biblical perspectives and just general perspectives on all things. Now, the misinformation, disinformation bill obviously would have had the effect of giving executive powers to ACMA, which is the Australian Communications and Media Authority, to allow them to censor what they deem as misinformation and disinformation. Many people will sort of say, well, there is sort of harmful ideas out there, there's harmful thoughts, but the issue is when you empower a state body to actually arbitrate what is truth, you ultimately end up seeing certain things censored as misinformation and disinformation, which are actually wholly true and good things. We often see Christian perspectives on life, for example, that life is dignified, that it begins at conception, and that abortion transgresses that. We often see that censored actually, or called or labelled misinformation. And so the real fear here for Christians, but also more broadly for Australians, was that they would actually be given those executive powers to a body that would then censor genuine opinion online. We just felt that was a real over-encroachment into people's freedom of expression. So we lobbied very hard in the Senate. We got all of our supporters to write into their senators. We had multiple key meetings with those senators specifically on the crossbench, and a number of them just after those conversations with us, as well as receiving correspondence and submissions from thousands of Australians across the nation, come out and just said, look, we can't support this because it's just too much of an encroachment onto people's freedom to be able to speak freely in this country. And so we are so pleased to see Labor come out and with it's just people in this country do love liberty. They love the freedom to be able to speak freely, to associate freely, to practice their religion freely. And that's something that governments in Australia need to uphold. Otherwise, they're going to get this kind of pushback.
We've been talking about this misinformation, disinformation bill for a long time. In fact, I think we were some of probably the earliest ones who were saying this looks pretty dangerous for a democracy. And then you had all these independent crossbench senators saying, I don't think we can vote for this. And then at the last minute, the Greens even agreed that this was actually a bad thing. It's a matter of if this legislation was to go through, it would really put the incumbent government of the day in a very powerful position, and everybody else is disadvantaged. So, do you think this is why everybody's basically come and rebelled against this and said, no, this is a bad thing for democracy?
Yeah, I think you're right on the money there, Neil. I mean, democracies thrive off accountability, don't they? And so when a government makes a certain decision or a certain claim, there is that provision for accountability from the opposition government or for those independents, or in some cases minor parties like the Greens, to actually call that out. But if you've given executive powers then to the incumbent government, as you say, to be able to censor what it deems as appropriate speech and non-appropriate speech, you can find yourself in a situation where the government is actually pushing out mistruths, or one might say propaganda in the worst form, and no one's able to question it because any questioning of that information is censored as misinformation. And people just recognise, whether it be the Greens or the Independents, that that is just an inappropriate overreach and it's too much power for a current government. And that's why they've all sort of fundamentally come out and said, wait a second, we're really concerned about this and we're going to reject it. So I think you're right on the money there, Neil. Yeah.
Okay, we'll call it a big win, and democracy dodges a bullet. And, the bottom line is, isn't it? How can you have freedom of political debate if two sides can't argue in political forums now, and or in public forums anywhere, whether it's online or whether it's in mainstream media? This is a challenging thing, and the interesting dimension I'll ask you about, though, is that so many times, and particularly with state legislation, we've seen things that get withdrawn and pulled, and then they get renamed by something else, and then it comes back and basically the same provisions, and things go through without a whole lot of debate. There's similar things that are going on in the States too. What are you aware of in New South Wales?
Well, there was the New South Wales Law Reform Commission review actually into a certain provision in the Crimes Code within New South Wales, which is 93Z. And this is a particular provision which regulates hate speech in New South Wales. And there'd been calls to review this particular provision. So similar situation where we're addressing how much freedom should people have to say certain things when it can be harmful or when it can be deemed, you might say, misinformation, disinformation, as the federal government was labelling it. And what happened here was the New South Wales Law Reform Commission conducted a review, and it's actually recently found that there should be no change to the threshold of 93Z, which is a really positive, again, a positive win and outcome for freedom of expression in New South Wales. In effect, currently it's considered incriminating hate speech if you incite violence towards another person or towards a group on the basis of their race or religion. But there was calls to lower that down to not just incite violence, but actually make hateful slurs or insults or ridicule someone. Now, obviously, none of us want people to be ridiculed and insulted. It's a horrible thing within the community. And at a very community level, we want to obviously educate and help citizens to use speech that is not hateful and not ridiculing towards others and that respects them and tolerates other people's opinion. But if you start using the instruments and the levers of the state to control language more broadly, and anything that's deemed as hateful is then incriminating, there's certain instances where actual perspectives that are genuine, i.e. I'll use a biblical perspective again, saying that marriage can only be between a male and a female as God instituted it. These begin to be designated as hateful speech. And then if you lower that threshold too far, it can end up incriminating, and you can end up with pastors or everyday Christians in jail or fined a hefty fine for simply stating a biblical perspective. So this is a similar review that's happened at a New South Wales state level. And again, a really big win here for religious freedom and freedom of expression, with the Law Reform Commission coming out and saying, you know what, we don't need to lower that bar at this point in time. What we actually need to do is empower law enforcement to better use the current legislative provision to protect people from the incitation of violence against them. And we think particularly of some of the recent anti-Semitic attacks within Sydney, Neil. Those are the kind of things we're looking at stopping here. Is the burning of cars, Jewish cars, as well as hateful slurs towards that community. That's what we're actually looking to give the police force the power and the ability to step in there and say, hey, this is not okay and it needs to be regulated appropriately.
Okay, so there are already existing laws by which all of those violence aspects can be dealt with. Hey, let's move on. The Equality Bill in New South Wales, any developments on that? Because this was something that came up even as long as a month or two ago. What's the latest on that Equality Bill?
Yeah, I think since we last spoke, Neil, the bill has actually been passed through the upper house, and so it's now assented into law. However, I will say that the bill is very, very heavily amended from its original iteration when it came into Parliament, and that's a testament to the work of many Christians, supporters of ACL, but also other organisations in calling out the overreach of this legislation as well. One of our key concerns with the Equality Bill as it was passed was actually with one of the amendments made to the Births, Deaths and Marriages Act, which now allows people to self-designate their sex on their birth certificate as per their what we here call gender identity, or a self-felt internal perception of one's sex as opposed to one's biological sex. And effectively what that allows is for a male like myself to actually apply with the Births, Deaths and Marriages to have my birth certificate and my legal documentation reflect female. And obviously the implications of that are quite clear, which is that if men can now be women, then they can also access women's only spaces, and there's implications for the safety, the dignity and the integrity of those spaces in New South Wales, given this legislative change.
Interesting, isn't it? What we might be seeing this week, it could be the last sitting week of Parliament before the next federal election. And that all depends on, all sorts of things, and even the possibility that the Prime Minister could call an early election if things don't look good so far as the economics go. Hey, let me ask you about federal issues around this. You're talking about that Equality Bill New South Wales-wise. If there is a election called early, or if there's one called around, March, April, May next year, is there a priority issue, or there might be a number, but around the sorts of things that the ACL might be making sure that our listeners would know about when it comes to issues to do with, this whole issue with biological sex? How do you think that might actually be part of a federal election, and what the ACL might be focusing on?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. You're certainly right there. There is a number of things we'll be asking for, but specifically in relation to this issue of the importance of being explicit about what biological sex is. XX chromosomes for women, XY for men, and that clear differentiation that we see in the physical capacities of the two sexes of a binary nature, male and female. That is something that is very important to be defined in law, even when it just comes to someone's legal culpability, like when, for example, a biological man abuses a woman in a woman's space. We need to know legally that person was actually a male, and so they were, not in the appropriate incriminated accordingly. Now, ACL, we're calling for a clearer definition of biological sex in law, specifically in what's called the Sex Discrimination Act, or what we abbreviate as the SDA. This act is particularly responsible for actually protecting women against discrimination. But the problem is, Neil, is that in 2013, direct reference to male and female was actually removed from this particular act. How can you protect women if you can't even define what a woman is? And so for us, one of our big calls at the federal election is, well, let's get a clear biological definition of women within this particular act, so that we're actually protecting the group of people within our community that the legislation was originally intended to protect.
And as I understand it, that all changed under Julia Gillard's leadership. So getting a definition of what is a biological woman, what is a biological man into the Sex Discrimination Act may solve an awful lot of problems. And that sounds like it's going to be a mounting issue that we're going to be talking about in the lead up to the federal election. Hey, in New South Wales, we were talking last time around some issues that were developing with the Randwick City Council, where they had a motion where they wanted gender-neutral bathrooms in all of their council facilities. There's a development here. What's happening?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. So the Randwick City Council took this motion to the local government annual conference, which is where all 128 councils gather from around New South Wales to vote on certain motions, which will then give sort of precedent to certain legislative pushes within those local councils and petitions that they're going to make to New South Wales government at a state level. When they brought this motion forward, the concern was that now that identity documentation following the Equality Bill can be changed and can represent gender identity as opposed to biological sex, we're now going to see men being accessing all kinds of women's spaces at a council level. So within bathrooms, change rooms, but even community level sports. And Randwick City Council was actually pushing for this to become a reality. They wanted this to happen. And so what we did at ACL was we put it out in the media and we said, this is a real concern for all local councils in New South Wales and for the protection of women in those spaces. I mean, women shouldn't even have to think twice about accessing those spaces out of fear. But if reforms like this pass, then they do think twice because they know that there's potential that there could be biological men in those particular areas or in those community sports. And we wanted to push it out there in the media and make sure to get our supporters to call their local councilmen and councilwomen and to share their concerns. And the big development here, Neil, is that when it came to the vote at the annual conference, it was defeated 56% in favour of, 56% against, should I say, and 44% for the motion. And so this is a big win for women in New South Wales because it protects them and it protects the integrity of their spaces so that they can be safe to go into those spaces and play sports at a community level without fear.
Well, Joshua, no doubt there'll be other councils that have similar ideas, but there's one. Take that as another win. Number of wins to talk about in today's update, and no doubt there'll be listeners who'll be very encouraged by that. For listeners to keep up to date with the issues that are developing, let me just point them to the ACL website. That's the website of the Australian Christian Lobby, acl.org.au. acl.org.au. There'll be some links there to articles and updates, how you can keep up to date with some of the crazy things that are going on, but also look for those Christian dimensions to how you might see those sorts of issues. Joshua Rowe is the ACL State Director for New South Wales and the ACT. Joshua, thanks so much for updating us today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.